Welcome to the 3-voice counterpoint video. This will be an introduction to chords and harmony in counterpoint. For many, chord progressions help one understand the basic framework of music, or at least certain styles of music. However, the theory of chord progressions will not be applicable to the counterpoint exercises. We're going to observe the vertical harmonic moments, also known as the harmonic intervals, as arbitrary moments that happen as a result of 3 separate voices moving horizontally with good voice leading. Composing for 3 voices while allowing each separate voice to move with equal melodic fluency allows us to make some compromises. With this, we will now have some more options than we did with our 2-voice writing. Okay, so now let's listen to this example. This is going to give us a chance to listen to a 3-voice texture that slowly moves through whole notes. From the very beginning with the 1-to-1 counterpoint exercises with 2 voices, we were taught that there are only 4 consonant harmonic intervals: the 3rd, 5th, 6th, and octave. You can take it a step further and split it up into 2 groups, where you have 2 imperfect consonant intervals and 2 perfect consonant intervals. Your 2 imperfect consonant intervals are your 3rd and your 6th, and your 2 perfect consonant intervals are your 5th and your octave. These are the only choices for creating a consonant harmonic interval above a bass note. Let's take a look at the options we have to add 2 different consonant intervals above the note C. As you can see, we have 6 chord options in closed position. These are considered chords because they consist of 3 notes, and within that they contain 2 or more different notes. Although the ones that repeat the bass note are incomplete because they're missing a note, the 3rd or the 5th, they're still considered chords because it's playing these 3 notes at the same time. If we included chords that use 2 of the same notes, the list would be much larger. This type of chord is usually avoided in strict 3-voice counterpoint. Having an interval of an octave between the upper parts of a chord was thought to be a weak voicing. This could do with the fact that the octave is the first overtone of the overtone series, also known as the harmonic series, which means the top note of the octave is harmonizing with the first and strongest overtone of the note below it, making it blend with that note. So you can see why this could be thought to be weak, because it's not standing on its own as much as a note that wouldn't be harmonizing as strongly with that same note that's being produced in the overtones of that note below it. Whether you want to believe that or not, the fact is that we will be avoiding these types of chords in these exercises. For a general rule of thumb, octave intervals should only double the note in the bass voice. Figured bass is used to identify the intervals above the bass note. Figured bass gives us a simple identification of each interval because it does not specify which register each intervals are in. This means that if we take this first example here, the 5-3 chord, then we could also play this in open position, such as the example below. The 3rd is technically a compound third, also known as a 10th. We will be thinking of a 10th as the same thing as a 3rd, a 12th will be a 5th, and so on. The figured bass numbers identify the intervals formed with the upper voices and the bass notes. But one thing it does not show is the intervals formed between the upper voices, which is equally as important. We can see that the intervals formed from the top 2 voices of the 6-3 and the 8-5 chord is a perfect 4th. As we know by now, 4ths are dissonances. In fact, some people even sell shirts about this. But this is not a problem. According to rule number 1 of composing counterpoint with 3 voices, which states that when fourths are formed between the upper voices, they are treated as imperfect consonances. So we need to take that in. It's a fourth, but it's treated as an imperfect consonance, not a perfect consonance. This means that the only time fourths are considered dissonant is when they are formed between the bass with any other voice. In other words, that would show up in the numbers of the figured bass, since the figured bass is taking the bass note and then numbering the intervals that occur in relationship above that bass note. Since the fourths are going to be treated as imperfect consonances, this means you will have no problem approaching the fourths in direct motion, or even doing parallel fourths. This is perfectly fine. Since it's an imperfect consonant, it would be similar to doing consecutive thirds and sixths. And to take that even one step further, we technically will be able to do parallel fourths as well as consecutive fourths, and I will explain that in a second. But first, if we look at the 6-5 chord, we notice this has a dissonant second between G and A. Because of this, we're not able to use this chord in these 1-to-1 three-voice exercises. This chord contains a dissonant interval that is not able to be justified at this level. But this is a very important and useful chord that will appear in later videos, so don't you worry about it. The 5-3 and 6-3 chords are the most useful of these options harmonically, as they contain 3 different notes that are all consonant. Additionally, those are the 3 notes that make up the full version of the triad. In this case, we have a root position and a first inversion triad. This in return will display a richer harmony with the 3 different notes. The other examples that we can use all contain an octave. This means that the lowest note is repeated, and therefore these chords only have 2 different notes and 1 repeated note. Okay, so now forming a melodic cadence with 3 voices. Most of our cantus firmus that we have been practicing with throughout this video series have mostly all had the bass line descend in stepwise motion to the tonic, from scale degree 2 to scale degree 1. In historic terms, this is known as the tenor cadence, which can be thought of as the 2-to-1. Then in the top voice, the ascent from scale degree 7 to scale degree 1 is known as the soprano cadence. These 2 cadences are the smoothest options for a melodic closure, as well as being a part of the ending of many pieces during the common practice period. Using these 2 cadences in combination is known as the clausula vera, translated as true closure. This is a very conventional approach to ending a section or a movement of an entire piece during the 16th and 17th centuries. Technically, these are called the soprano cadence and the tenor cadence. These can actually be flipped, where a soprano forms a tenor cadence and the tenor forms a soprano cadence, as you can see in the example below. This results in contrary motion, but now from the outside in versus before it was from the inside out. Assigning a name to these instead of just calling them the 7-to-1 and 2-to-1 cadences is a simple way to remember these cadences better. And to add some history to it, in early music thinking, the soprano cadence would instead be known as the clausula cantizan, and the tenor cadence would be known as the clausula tenorizan. Together, these create the clausula vera. You also have the bassizans and the altizans. In the beginning, the alto cadence was more of a filler voice, but more about that in the 4-voice counterpoint video. So now we know conventionally the soprano cadence uses the 7th scale degree to the 1st scale degree, and the tenor cadence uses the 2nd scale degree to the 1st scale degree, forming that contrary motion. And then it can also happen the opposite, to where the soprano forms the 2-to-1 cadence and the tenor forms the 7-to-1 cadence. But this is a very basic way of understanding this. Historically, musicians were thinking of movements in the bass line and looking for implications of cadences as well as modulations. This was based off solfeggio, which was different and more complex than the solfege that we know and practice today. Where every bass note could and often was thought of in solfege, which revealed certain relationships between notes, semitones, and cadential implications. We can't say what the earlier musicians were thinking because we're not there right now, but we do know the books that they used to teach their students as well as teach themselves, and this reveals a completely different way of thinking about music. More about that in my hexachordal solfeggio video. Modern musicians do not use these terms, but instead a practitioner of early music would use these terms and this way of thinking. But it's good to note that in early music, oftentimes counterpoint was not the result of someone sitting and writing just from pen to paper a contrapuntal fugue, but instead we have a lot of evidence that this was based on certain methods of improvising, using things like the rule of the octave and partimento to create proper voice leading on the spot. With that, a composer could either improvise the entire piece on the spot, or they could use these methods to build the piece. So my channel is going to be going a lot more into that stuff after these basic counterpoint videos that are mostly from Fuchs's Gradus ad Parnassum. So now, how could we go about adding a third voice to this clausula vera that is already good enough on its own? If we choose to add a bass voice, then it must resolve on scale degree 1. The problem is, if we move in stepwise motion with the bass line, then we are going to be creating parallel octaves with either the soprano or the tenor voice, depending on if it steps up or down. In other words, we would be choosing to move stepwise from either scale degree 2 or 7 to scale degree 1. In this situation, we are going to have to leap to scale degree 1 from a scale degree that will work. There is only one note that will work, scale degree 5, descending a leap of a fifth to scale degree 1. The notes G, B, D form a 5-3 chord. In terms of three-voice counterpoint, this cadence is the most common. When scale degree 5 leaps to scale degree 1 in the bass voice, it is called the bass cadence. Doing this is one of the best ways to bring about a melodic closure. However, it is not a great choice when thinking in perspective of counterpoint. Now the bass and the tenor voice both approach the octave using direct motion. And pay attention to how the soprano voice is stepping up to the perfect consonants. Still using scale degree 5, what happens if we place it an octave down, so now it leaps to scale degree 1 with a leap of a fourth? This causes there to be direct motion between the bass and soprano voices, which is even worse occurring in the outer voices. So now again, because the upper voices didn't change, we still have that step with the soprano to the perfect consonants. I'm pointing this out because some less strict counterpoint theorists will consider this fine as long as the upper voice moves a step into the perfect consonants when it is moving in direct motion. But we can also see before the direct motion was between the bass and the tenor, so it was more like direct motion to a hidden octave, or at least it was to the bass and the tenor voice, however you want to look at it. But when it's between the bass and the soprano, that's definitely going to stick out more for one auditorily. But then because of this, if we think about a better choice or a worse choice, we can see that the better choice would be forming the direct motion between the bass and the tenor versus the bass and the soprano. So the choice that you see down below is the option that you should avoid, even though technically it is very similar to the option above. So this is a point where a composer has to stop and realize that sometimes when you compose for more than two voices, direct motion to a perfect consonance can sometimes be unavoidable. But as you can see, we still do not want parallel motion. We only run into a position where we have to do this when we have cadences. This will only work if the direct motion is similar motion and not parallel motion. This is the reason why there is such a large amount of emphasis on no parallel octaves or fifths in the pedagogy of counterpoint. And you never want parallel octaves, but they become a lot more unavoidable once you start using 3 or more voices. But it's also good to point out, if you look at some of J.S. Bach's students and their exercises that were handed into Bach, you can see Bach making corrections and adding a lot of marks even on inner voices where there would be what we would consider hidden parallel octaves or fifths, and you can see where he marked them as mistakes. So those are things to consider. How strict do you want to take this? Your choice. And of course, if you practice the most strict possible, then you know how to do that. That's your pattern of thought, and then you can branch away from that and do less strict. And it would probably be a lot more difficult if you didn't learn it the completely strict way from the beginning and then tried to apply more strict rules as you were going, because you'd have to learn more stuff instead of just letting go of certain things instead. We should still try to avoid direct motion whenever we can. You have the option to allow this type of voice leading error when it occurs in a cadence. If it does not occur at the cadence, then make sure that the top voice is moving in contrary motion to the other 2 voices. So now, still looking at the cadence, what if instead of adding the voice below these 2 voices, we now insert a voice in between the tenor and soprano voice? This is done by making the cantus the lowest voice in the texture. We need to find a note in the middle of scale degree 2 and scale degree 7, in other words above D and below B, that also creates a consonance with both of these notes. Like before, we only have one option that will work properly. Scale degree 4 gives us the note F. This forms a third above D and an augmented fourth above B. Now, augmented fourth, you might hear that and think, whoa, what's going on there? This is obviously a dissonance, but fourths between the upper voices are treated as imperfect intervals. This accounts for all diatonic fourths, not just ones that are perfect. Since we are resolving to scale degree 1 in the other voices, then we will not be able to do the same thing now in this voice that is in the span of an octave between the other 2 voices if we still want to keep these 3 voices, because scale degree 1 is already occupied in this span of the octave that we see between the tenor and soprano voices, which we're working in between. In this instance, the alto voice of scale degree 4 will have the option to either ascend to scale degree 3 or descend to scale degree 5. This is also known as the alto cadence, either 4 to 3 or 4 to 5. Another name would be the Burgundian cadence. This is your choice when you have an exercise where you either want to end on an 8-3 chord or an 8-5 chord. In Gratis ad Parnassum, the student character Joseph liked the 4-3 alto cadence, while on the other hand, the teacher character Alois liked the 4 to 5 alto cadence. These can be thought of as 2 different styles. There's also a contrary in perspective on what style to solve for the cantus when using 3 voices. Alois creates the example shown. Let's give it a listen and then talk about it. This example shows us how consecutive motion of imperfect intervals between upper voices is not as bad when there is that other voice below it. This is if that bottom voice is moving in contrary motion to the other 2 voices at that time. Next, the Joseph character shows us his example on how he would improve Alois' example. In measure 2, we can observe that Alois' original has an 8-3 chord, which Joseph then turns into a 5-3 chord. Choosing this chord is a better option harmonically, as it contains 3 different notes that all belong to a triad, versus Alois' example, which only contain 2 different notes and an octave. To accomplish this, Joseph leaps to an A in the tenor voice. The perspective of the 2 characters is that Joseph cares more about accomplishing a more full harmony, using complete triads as much as he could, while on the other hand, Alois wants his response to reflect the old vocal style of Palestrina. Because of this, he cares more about creating a smooth conjunct line that will sacrifice full triads in order to keep stepwise motion. As you can see, these are merely two different styles being presented separately so you can observe their nature. We can think of Aloy's perspective as being more focused on melody overall. Aloy's could still be interested in creating good harmony, and Joseph probably still wants to create a good melody. The point is that Joseph's perspective is focused on harmony for the most part. Aloy is more focused on the melody. As time progressed, it became progressively more usual for teachers to want a more full harmony using complete triads. Some teachers even went as far as making it a mandatory rule to have at least one complete 5-3 or 6-3 triad in each measure. A good example of this would be François-Joseph Fétis. Constant spans of disjunct movement is normally avoided in a bass line more so than it would be in the other voices. But we can see that Fétis' bass line leaps all over the place and rarely moves in stepwise motion. Additionally, you can observe quite large leaps that are formed in a row, creating consecutive leaps of the same interval. This works well when assigning this to bassline instruments, as lines like this could be idiomatic for bass instruments. However, if this amount of disjunct movement occurred in a row in any of the other voices, it would not work as well. This could be the perspective where we're leading away from the vocal style of counterpoint and we're more leading towards a counterpoint that is thought around being played on instruments. With this, then we can imagine the top lines being played by instruments in the registers as shown. Just as an example, let's say the bottom voice is played by a cello, and they're just playing a little bit higher, not so much in the lower range. And you can see then the viola is playing the middle line in sort of its mid register, and then the violin could be the top line in its lower middle register. We can see this definitely fits into the harmonic style of composing. If we observe the figures for each note of the bass line, we can see it's mostly perfect and imperfect consonant triads. Then Jacob Gran from YouTube creates a response of his own where he creates a bass line that is much more conjunct, fitting it more into the melodic style of composing. But one thing to observe is that there is only one additional chord that is not a full triad. The melodic style, as seen here, has 5 chords with octaves, and the harmonic style, as shown before with Fétis' example, has only 4. The main difference in these examples is that the bass line in Jacob Gran's example is much more conjunct compared to the bass line in Fétis' example. Here are 2 cantus firmus created by Nadia Boulanger, first in G major and then in E minor. These can be used to create one-to-one counterpoint responses using 3 voices. Like always, the exercises are available for free PDF download from my Google Drive. There's a link down below in the description for that. And then also, like always, there is a PDF download of the content displayed throughout this entire video, so you can further print it, study it, or whatever you choose to do. It could be good just to print it and use it to follow along this video. You can write your own notes where you choose, and each page should have enough room to do that. And as you're going to see in a second, I will give an option to make this even more interesting for you, additionally being more of a learning lesson that will not pose much more of a challenge to you. Now with 3 voices, we have more options with our responses. Before with 2 voices, we had only the options to either respond with our counterpoint above or below the cantus firmus, but now we can think in a slightly different perspective. Which voice is the cantus firmus going to be in? Now it can either be in the bass voice, the middle voice, or the soprano voice. The result will then be, with the cantus in the bass, the counterpoint will be in the soprano and the middle voice. With the cantus in the middle voice, the counterpoint will be in the soprano voice and the bass voice. With the cantus in the soprano voice, the counterpoint will be in the bass voice and in the middle voice. Doing each one of these options 1 time each for both exercises will result in 6 exercises. But to make it more interesting, I transposed the melody from Nadia into 4 new keys. This results in a different key for each response. Additionally, there is a repetition between switching from major to minor between each response, plus the cantus cycles through middle, below, and above twice, so you should get some good practice with each optional position of the cantus. On top of all this, I then make the original cantus that is in major and transpose it in A major, then in G minor, for some additional practice on the same given melody. Similarly, on the next page, I take the cantus that is normally in minor and I transpose it to D minor first, then I transpose it to E major, so again you get some additional practice on the same given melody, minor and major, or two different modes. Feel free to email me your responses. When doing so, you can mention if you'd like me to analyze it in my response video for these exercises, or if you'd like me to just personally analyze it, feel free to send me an email, and I'll try to find the time to analyze it. I've done response videos for all the exercises found in the video series. You can find those in the Counterpoint playlist linked below. Thanks for watching. We have come pretty far in these Counterpoint exercises, but still we have yet to climb to the top of the tip of the iceberg of Counterpoint, where there's a tremendous more to understand other than this if you seriously want to compose things like fugues in the style of J.S. Bach. And more than that, if you want to be able to compose contrapuntal forms of music efficiently and without struggle or too much time spent. A properly trained musician in counterpoint can see any bass line and then improvise a counterpoint for that on the spot, both with their voice and with their instrument. Usually this would be a keyboard instrument which allows for the use of chords on each note. With enough practice, they could go as far as creating an improvised fugue from a bass line on the spot with no struggle at all. As you can probably imagine, this is very difficult and therefore not the level of an average musician. More on all of this in my next videos, where I will be teaching about possibly the most important lesson on composing for counterpoint in the style of all of the composers that we know of. This being the rule of the octave, which I will explain how this will lead into an understanding of portamento. In return, one will learn the skills to be able to improvise over a bass line with perfect voice leading and beautiful harmony efficiently at ease. Next, we will then learn how to take that material and then make it more stylized, where then it will sound more like music with melodic, harmonic, and rhythmic interest. Subscribe to not miss any videos, and give this video a thumbs up if you found it helpful, and that will help others to potentially see it as well. Until next time, have a good one. Bye.